right? So first of all, as you probably know, having been on this webinar, this is a project that's really is an important future thinking project. And so it's thinking about the future strategic direction of the chiropractic profession and the industry. And it's being hosted by ChiroCongress, obviously. And they selected a team of consultants, which we're part of, to go through this process of developing both first the vision and then moving into the strategy development and then the implementation. And obviously, you know, like everything, the industry is in a state of flux. And so thinking about the future, one of the things we know from our future planning work is that if you're going to be effective in future thinking, there's a few things you need to take account of. So one is that it's very useful to explore and anticipate a range of plausible futures. So really think about what is the range of possible, plausible futures in front of us, and then really trying to understand the impacts and the preferences. And of course, it's also important to consider trajectory, so the direction of change, and velocity, so the speed of change. So obviously sometimes you need to move and move fast, right? And so the scenario planning tries to sort of tease apart the sentiment from the industry about what direction do we want to go and how fast do we need to act on that. And at the same time, understanding that the world is complex and that we're trying to bring together a lot of different trends into the analysis. In terms of the process, so just as a very quick schematic, we kicked off in October. We did an online launch of the portal. We had a very large industry survey that ran through November and December. And we had about 3,500 people, a bit over that, complete that survey. Those results, about 2/3 of them are already published on the portal and the rest are going up next week. We've had some cohort focus groups. We held a key driver workshop session, which was looking at the key issues that came out of the survey. Held the think tank in January, which will review their work today. And we're at this point here, which is where we're hosting a series of virtual workshops to explore expected and preferred future. And so the presentation and the survey is part of that. And then that'll lead into the future scenario and industry foresight report. And then we're going to have a future summit in March, which will be the transition between the visioning process moving into the strategic planning portion of it. The purpose of the think tank, so we're going to review their work. Their job was to explore the future, to ask the hard questions, to think creatively. So it really was a future gazing exercise to look at what could be the future direction potential of the industry. In terms of how we built up the data for the think tank, just to very quickly lay out the methodology. So this screenshot is actually from the, oops, going the wrong way. This screenshot is from the project portal. So if you've been to the portal, you know there's a series of drop-down menus, discussion boards, and so on. But a key part of the Future Perception Survey was talking about the key drivers. And we asked people to respond in that survey, and as I said, 3,500 people did. And we looked at a range of key drivers. There was 18, I think, in total, and we asked people to think about their importance, their impact, and how well prepared the industry was for those. And we were doing that to tease out what we thought were the two big themes. What are the two major themes that are having the biggest impact on shaping the future direction of the industry? And on the portal, this data is there, but these were all the various drivers and how they sort of spread out on an axis of the nature of the impact. So potentially very negative, very positive. How well prepared are we? Not at all prepared, very well prepared. Size of the circle was its importance. And there was two sort of clusters of drivers that were sort of the outliers or the extremities that we found very interesting that we worked with the steering committee on. So one was around, these two actually, was around the cost of education and the burden of the school debts and loans. So two drivers that are important, potential big negative impact, not really prepared for, right? So it could be a real future splitting topic, that whole issue about the professional pipeline. The other cluster was up here. The one that's at the outlier here was the appreciation acceptance of the chiropractic's role in the mainstream medical. Sorry, I don't know why I keep jumping through. But these other ones here were all about the penetration, essentially, of chiropractic into the medical system. So it was about the expansion into healthcare groups, into the VA and hospital services, inclusion in government programs and so on, right? But there was a cluster here which was really framed around this appreciation and acceptance. What we did in terms of thinking about the future canvas, so we identified these two sort of macro themes, and we finessed this a little bit with the steering committee to get the language right. But one was around this notion of industry acceptance and utilization. So for the chiropractic industry, and remember we're looking out to 2030 and we're trying to understand what are the two big future splitting axes. So this was seen as one of them. And we said, well, we don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but these endpoints, these descriptions here, are trying to articulate what the endpoints of a continuum could be around this major axis. So one was industry isolation. So what would happen if the chiropractic profession is isolated or marginal to the mainstream healthcare sector? Other healthcare disciplines might compete for the chiropractic patients by expanding into that realm, right? So that could be a possible outcome of this axis. The other end of the continuum was around industry parity. So it's sort of probing, well, what would happen if the utilization of chiropractic services grows, the penetration and integration into the healthcare system expands, that might cascade to increased compensation that creates more economic parity for the chiropractic profession. Quite different outcomes, ends of a continuum. The vertical one was around the professional pipeline, which picked up those drivers that were in the first cluster. So down the bottom here, we're asking, well, what if we follow a traditional professional development, if that sort of stays the course to 2030? Where colleges and universities continue their existing support of the coursework, and the cost of education remains a key impediment to recruiting new professionals. At the other end, we're asking this question about, well, what happens if the professional pipeline transforms, where we start to see more published research, anecdotal evidence. There's a different kind of an approach to professional development. Perhaps triggers consistency, increased professional opportunities, and maybe different levels of enrolment. So these were these big four scenarios. So each one of these, so if you take this big green box in the sort of middle, we said, okay, that's our future canvas. And then there are these four scenario spaces, and they're shaped by the combinations of the endpoints of these axes. So scenario A, for example, is a future that we played out in the think tank where asking, well, what would happen if industry isolation was coupled together with transformation of the professional pipeline? If they were the two big sort of directions that things went in, not whether you like it or not, just if that was what was to happen, what would the industry look like under those prevailing conditions? And then scenario B was the endpoints of the two axes that frame that, and so on, right? So, and this was regarded as a fairly plausible future canvas. And what we did in the think tank was really played out and sort of filled out a narrative around each of these four different major scenarios. And some of the dimensions that we looked at in terms of as we built those out, it was quite multidimensional. Scope of services, the role in the healthcare industry, issues of professional cohesion and unification, the utilisation, the economics of the profession, political and regulatory power, public perception, and so on, right? And we asked people to consider those as they played out the future they were assigned to. And I want to give you just a very sort of brief vignette of the scenarios just to give you a sense of it. But the names that they came up with, was one of their assignments, was to describe that future and then come up with a name and a couple of words that would sort of give you the sense of what the future for the profession would be under those scenario conditions. So you can see chiropractic next blockbuster, and that's referring to Blockbuster Video, of course, and we know what happened there, right? Indispensable health allies, the crux, and Groundhog Day. So let me just explain these a little bit just to give you the flavour of the scenarios. So the first one, scenario A, was it's a combination of industry isolation with transformation of the professional pipeline. They called it the next blockbuster. So this idea that it starts off looking pretty good, right? But in this future, it ends up being, the chiropractic industry potentially ends up being becoming irrelevant or a bit of a dinosaur. There was really a question in this scenario about, does the chiropractic industry essentially just get absorbed or disappear in playing this scenario out over 10 years. It didn't start off looking that way, but that's where they got to after 10 years. And what they saw in this future is that the broad characteristics that would be the outcomes for this scenario is that a lack of coherent messaging around the profession would cause public confusion. It allows other healthcare professionals to take over the chiropractic space. So that's the existential threat, that you get, this creep of other professions moving in. Because the industry is isolated, the mainstream would sort of creep across and start to take up the space that is the services provided now. Lack of accepted standards make it difficult to maintain a unified voice, and chiropractors are squeezed out of any legislative power they once had. So again, this sort of isolation, and there was a certain tension in this because part of the push was this, upwards in the transformation of the professional pipeline. So there'd be, attempts to create more rigor and so on, but somewhat would happen in a vacuum. So the industry would still be subject to these external challenges or threats. And they also saw that enrolments would decrease over time, and there'd be a sense of a race to the bottom of the profession. And really why that was they saw that this would put the squeeze on practitioners, and you might start to get more sort of marginal type of practices, and that would challenge the standards, and then perhaps degrade some of the public perception and so on. So not really a fantastic outcome, but one that they felt was very plausible, and one that would really sort of challenge the very future of the industry. The next scenario B, so this is a coupling together of the professional pipeline together with the industry parity concept. The broad characteristics they saw for this one is they actually saw this as a future scenario where the profession would transform, and it would achieve parity with other healthcare professions, and that's that brings with it change. So don't think these scenarios are necessarily all good or all bad, right? There's pluses and minuses. So in a scenario where transformations occurring, that brings with upsetting the status quo and some of the norms that might be at play. But they did see that that's what would happen in this future. Big pharma is no longer a key driver in healthcare, and the chiropractic services would emerge as key to healthy lifestyles. So they saw this in this future, the chiropractic industry potentially being able to pick up and leverage off these big trends in wellness and healthy lifestyles, particularly with aging populations and so on. And of course, that leading to better public understanding, because we have more sort of professional evidence that's being published. It's plugged into the mainstream, and so the chiropractic care would be seen to become just a really key part of a lot of people's healthcare regime or their suite of services that they use from the healthcare industry. The crux. And so this is, again, quite a different scenario, right? So it's a coupling together of the traditional professional development with industry parity. It's going to share some things a little with the previous, because it's sharing the industry parity side of the scenario matrix, but quite a different outcome. So they saw that schools continue to support the existing chiropractic coursework, and that would limit industry growth and parity, right? The sense that if there wasn't the evolution or the transformation in the educational framework, that the industry would be perceived to be not staying abreast of changes and so on. Acceptance and utilisation would increase where the services are integrated into the healthcare system. So where they were in the industry parity sides, you might see some increase, but overall a lack of consensus on internal divisions would continue to plague the profession, and the political cloud is lost over time. So kind of actually scenario A and scenario C, there's sort of push-pull plus minus sort of themes going on there a bit. So they're sort of complicated, which is why they came up with the name of the crux, I think, which is, there's this really key thing, and it's like a real problem that we can't quite solve, right? And it sort of goes either way. But they weren't very optimistic about that future in terms of the overall benefits. They saw some people would benefit, particularly those that were able to integrate, but other parts of the profession might, sort of get caught up in internal divisions and perhaps lose public reputation and so on. And then Groundhog Day was the scenario D, and this is the coupling together of a trend towards industry isolation and sort of sticking with traditional professional development. Basically, their summary of it was the chiropractic profession cannot get its act together. The lack of cohesion in the profession perpetuates disarray, and really this sense of losing its way in terms of losing political power, losing funding, sort of infighting continuing, and then ultimately there'd be a loss of public confidence. As the legitimacy of the profession somewhat declines because it's not grounded on evidence base. And the industry is not plugged into the mainstream, so it's sort of seen as off to the side, and there would be all sorts of questions about its legitimacy and what the foundation of the industry is. So they were the broad 4 big scenarios, right? And I know I just zipped through those like at warp speed, but probably gives you a sense of the what they're about. And I want to set you up because this diagram and the next one I'm going to show you are going to be key charts in the survey we're going to ask you to take in a minute. And I want to just explain a couple of things, right? So this is the axes and the scenarios, the same framework, right? But I've sort of pushed them into the background a little bit. And I've brought to the foreground this grid. So we know that life's more complex than 4 big versions of the future, right? And we talked about these axes being continuums. And by placing this 10 by 10 grid over this matrix, it then gives us potentially 100 nuanced different versions of the future. So for example, you can imagine that the further you get into the corner, the more extreme version of the scenario you're dealing with, or you could have versions here which are sort of middle line on the professional development, but might be right at one end in terms of the industry acceptance and utilization. So as a way to kind of sort of play out this sort of much broader range of possible futures, and which would all have sort of implications and consequences. And what we're going to ask you to think about in the survey is, if you take this as a future canvas, right, which is sort of at least a first mapping of a plausible future, we want you to think about 2 things. So one is expected future and one is preferred future. And the notion of expected future is, where do you think in this 100-cell matrix, where do you think the industry is going to end up if it keeps going the way it's going, right? So if it doesn't really change course, right, just tracks that, whatever the current trajectory is from your view, whereabouts in this scenario world do you think it's most likely to end up? And you can pick at the level of 1 out of 100 of these possible scenarios. The other thing we're going to ask you to think about is preferred future. So where do you think in this scenario sort of framework is the most optimal future for the industry and the profession, knowing that the further you get into the corners, the more extreme the versions are, and the more change or the more the more you're pushing on different ends of these axes, and that comes with pluses and minuses and so on. And so in the vision survey, which Heather will drop the link in a minute, there'll be some initial profiling questions. So it'll take about 10 or 15 minutes to do the survey. So we're going to invite you to sort of jump on and do it straight after. So while this is fresh in your mind, and you'll see this chart in the survey. So it's the same scenario matrix with the scenario names. And this is the x-axis is the horizontal one, the y-axis is the vertical one. And we've put this 1 to 10 numbering system here. So basically you're able to identify coordinates, right? So the idea is, if you say, okay, I think the expected future is, I don't know, the C here in the crux, right? And how you record that is, for the expected future, that would be, so the x-axis and the y-axis, you'll see those boxes in the survey. So the C where the crux is would be an 8 on the x and a 3 on the y. So you would put 8, 3, right? So it gives you basically the coordinates for the future out of that 100 choices there you see is expected. And then the preferred, the same deal. You might say, oh, it's the B in Blockbuster. Well, that's going to be 2 on the X and 8 on the Y. And that diagram and those numbers are there in the survey, so you can look at that and sort of track your way into that, right? So we're going to drop the survey link into the chat, but we do have a minute if there's any questions you have about the material we've covered before we let you loose on the survey. So,
wow. So you're a survey company that ChiroCongress hired?
So yeah, I did. Sorry, I sort of skipped that because we don't have a lot of time. But we're a research and development company. Sorry, research and planning company, and we do a lot of work on future planning. So with organisations and industries and so on, helping them think about future trends and future possible outcomes, and then helping them sort of, I guess, align or coalesce around this notion of a preferred future, which is essentially then becomes the shared vision for the future, and then the strategy development flows from that. So once we understand, for example, the difference of where people see the expected future is to where the preferred future might be, then you've got to figure out how to close the gap, and that's the strategy planning part, which really begins after the 5th of March.
Sure. Yeah, we desperately need this. Now,
yeah.
do you see a chiropractor?
Do I don't right now, but I have, yes.
You have, okay. That's
Yes,
right.
I am familiar with that, and I'm just a Joe Blow in terms of medical. I'm just like everybody else, go to the doctor and dentist and so on, right? So
Sure.
we're not medical professionals, but I think our expertise is really in the realm of processes that allow very large groups of people in industries to have discussions about the future and figure out where they want to go.
Okay. I just felt for somebody having this conversation, it was important that somebody understood it. And if somebody like you had never been to a chiropractor, that would.
Well, I have been one. And actually, we have a steering committee. So ChiroCongress has a steering committee of about 15 professionals from across the country who work very closely with us in terms of, help design the surveys, and they participate in the think tank and so on, right? So the content is very, very strongly being built by the industry. And as I said, the 3,500 people who took the industry survey,
it was long. It was extensive. Yes.
Yeah. And we really appreciate people sort of sticking with that, sort of going through it. So, and you can actually, Heather, did you drop it in the chat survey?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think when you finish the survey, it'll redirect you back to the portal page I just was showing that has the drop-down menus and so on. And from there, you can find out more about our company and the work we do if you're interested in that, or the project, right? I mean, there's drop-downs about the project and so on. Right. Dr. Cook, did you have a question too?
Yeah. How many people were you hoping to have on this program? Because this is very skinny.
Yeah, we've got a few weather excuses, right? And so we're doing a series of these, of 5 of these live, and then we're taping them. And the best tape one we'll post just the portion of my presentation, and we'll make it available online afterwards as well. We never knew. The registrations are from a few to like about 10. So that's the sort of numbers we're at. But this is what we're really doing. This is a really important part of the validation of the think tank work. So all the people who were in the think tank have done the same survey as you, and what we want to do is make sure that, or see if there's any kind of shift in perceptions or views from people who are in the think tank versus people who are reacting to the material that was developed in the think tank.